crisp, early morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dealership, casting a serene glow over the polished marble floors and the shiny luxury vehicles that stood like silent sentinels in the showroom. It was the kind of place that oozed opulence, sleek chrome, black leather, and soft carpets underfoot. The hum of the city outside, distant yet ever-present, contrasted with the quiet reverence inside. This was the world of high-end real estate, a world where appearance often meant more than substance, and wealth was the greatest currency. At the heart of this world stood Tasha James, the CEO of James Luxury Motors, a woman in her early 40s, with a magnetic presence and an unshakable aura of confidence. She had built this empire from the ground up. Her rise in a predominantly white, male-dominated industry had not been easy, but it had been swift, a self-made success. Tasha had long felt the sting of being judged, not for her achievements or qualifications, but for her skin color. But it was something deeper than that, something that had been gnawing at her for years. Despite the boardrooms she conquered, the million-dollar deals she brokered, and the numerous accolades she had earned, Tasha had never been able to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the occasional dismissive glance or the microaggressions that came with being a woman of color in corporate spaces. It was the systemic biases, the unspoken assumptions, the way people reacted when they saw her in places where people like her didn't belong. The thought had simmered for years, but one particularly jarring incident set it in motion. A client had walked into her dealership and, after a brief interaction with one of her salespeople, had implied that Tasha wouldn't be able to afford the very cars on display. That was it, the tipping point. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated, but it was the first time she'd been made to feel as if she didn't belong in her own space. The person who had made the assumption wasn't just a client. They were someone who could very well afford to buy a luxury car. But because of her appearance, they had made the assumption that she wasn't worth their time. Tasha had spent too long climbing to the top, pushing through barriers that were meant to hold her back, only to be reduced to the assumptions made by others. The very place she had built, the dealership that bore her name, had become a reflection of everything that was wrong with the world. She had been privy to stories from her clients, particularly from those of color, about how they were treated when they came into her showroom. It was time to experience it herself. And so, Tasha made a decision. She would go undercover in her own dealership. She wanted to feel what her customers felt, experience firsthand the biases and assumptions that were made before her customers even had a chance to speak. She would see how her staff treated the people who walked through her doors, not as the CEO, but as just another potential buyer. She would witness the behavior that, up until now, had been impossible for her to observe from her executive office. As she sat behind her desk, preparing for the undercover operation, Tasha couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping over her. She had always been someone who faced challenges head-on, but this would be different. She wasn't just going to test her staff. She was going to test her own beliefs about the industry she had spent her life building. How far would her customers be willing to go to break through the barriers of race and wealth? Would the employees who had worked for her over the years turn a blind eye to the treatment of customers based on their race? And, most importantly, how would Tasha handle being in the shoes of her clients, people who were judged before they even had a chance to make a case for themselves? Her heart raced as she slipped on a disguise, the kind of attire she knew would make her blend in, but also remind her of the reality many of her customers faced every day. She set the plan into motion. Today, she would become a customer, and today, she would uncover the truth. Tasha stepped into the dealership showroom, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The scent of polished leather and fresh-cut flowers filled the air. As she glanced around at the rows of pristine luxury cars, each one a symbol of wealth and sophistication, the dealership was as immaculate as ever, a well-oiled machine designed to make clients feel elite, entitled, and special. But today, Tasha was neither elite nor special. Today, she was just another customer, blending in with the crowd, at least on the outside. Her gaze swept over the staff, all white, all neatly dressed in their tailored suits, looking polished and prepared for another day of high-end transactions. She noted their postures, confident, but tinged with an air of superiority. As her eyes met theirs, Tasha saw something flicker behind their polite smiles, a fleeting judgment, perhaps, or the arrogance of privilege that often accompanies people who are unaware of how their biases affect those around them. She approached the reception desk, where a woman in her late 20s sat with her back straight, typing furiously on her phone. Her blonde hair, perfectly styled, framed her face like something from a high-end magazine cover. She didn't look up when Tasha approached, but instead continued to tap away on her screen, completely absorbed in whatever conversation was unfolding in her virtual world. "Excuse me," Tasha said, her voice calm and steady, though her heart raced in her chest. "I'd like some information on your luxury cars." The woman, whose nameplate read Ava, didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slowly glanced up, her icy blue eyes scanning Tasha from head to toe, lingering just long enough to make her feel small. There was a split second where Ava's expression faltered, the briefest flash of confusion, but she quickly masked it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course," Ava said, her tone colder than Tasha had anticipated. "I can help you with that. What are you looking for today?" Tasha glanced at the sleek lineup of cars, each one more expensive than most people's homes. She pointed to a silver Bentley parked at the far end of the showroom. "That one," she said. Ava's eyes followed Tasha's finger, and for a brief moment, she hesitated, her gaze flickering between the car and Tasha's attire. A simple but stylish outfit that didn't scream wealth, but was certainly far from shabby. "That's a lovely choice," Ava replied, her words dripping with forced politeness. But Tasha caught the underlying judgment in her tone. She could feel it, the subtle shift in the air, the way Ava's gaze flicked to her clothes and back to her face, sizing her up in ways that spoke volumes. Ava tapped a few keys on her computer, and when she spoke again, her voice dropped just low enough for Tasha to feel uncomfortable. "I'm going to need to see some identification and proof of funds, just so we can ensure that you're qualified to view the car." Tasha paused. It wasn't the first time she'd been asked for documentation, but the tone of Ava's words was something new, something that stung. She had been prepared for questions, but this felt different, like she had been immediately placed into a box that suggested she didn't belong here, as though Ava had already assumed she couldn't afford the car based on her appearance alone. Tasha's jaw tightened, but she remained calm. This was part of the plan, after all. She had to experience it firsthand, and here it was, the bias that her clients had warned her about, playing out in real time before her eyes. "I assure you, I can afford this car," Tasha said, her voice steady, despite the growing discomfort. "But I'll provide the documentation you need." Ava raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. She slid a clipboard toward Tasha, and for a moment, their fingers brushed. Tasha felt Ava's slight recoil as she handed over the forms, a brief, subconscious movement, as though Tasha's presence had somehow contaminated her pristine environment. As Tasha filled out the required paperwork, she noticed the subtle glances from the other staff members. They were watching, not with curiosity or politeness, but with a mixture of disdain and skepticism. It was as though they were waiting for her to falter, to do something that would validate their assumptions about her. A few moments passed, and just as Tasha was finishing, a man in his early 40s, wearing a sharp black suit and holding a coffee cup, walked past. He shot a quick, dismissive glance at Tasha before turning to Ava, another one of those customers who thinks they can afford the top-tier models. He muttered, just loud enough for Tasha to hear. He didn't bother looking at her as he spoke. The words sliced through the air, cutting Tasha to the core. She wasn't used to being dismissed like this, not at this level, not in her own space. It was a stark contrast to the glossy, welcoming environment she had so carefully built. Here she was, among her own team, treated as though she was invisible, less than unworthy. Ava didn't flinch. She simply smiled and nodded in agreement, the complicity seamless, practiced. As Tasha handed the paperwork back, she watched the employee scan the forms, her eyes lingering too long on each line. It was obvious what was happening. This wasn't a routine check. It was an interrogation. "Thank you," Ava said, a little too sweetly. She barely made eye contact before turning back to her computer, completely disengaged from the interaction. Tasha stood there for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over her. She had expected this, of course. She had heard it in the stories, seen it in the reports. But experiencing it, feeling it, was another thing entirely. The treatment wasn't subtle. It was a sharp, cold dismissal, an act of bias that played out behind a veneer of civility. The luxury of the showroom, the wealth of the cars, seemed almost laughable in contrast to the cheap, dehumanizing treatment she had just received. She took a deep breath, adjusting her jacket, and walked toward the Bentley she had chosen, knowing that she wasn't done here, not by a long shot. The showroom, once filled with the hum of soft conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses, seemed to grow quieter as Tasha stood at the center of the space, surveying the luxury vehicles. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her, a subtle, yet unmistakable judgment that made her skin prickle. Her presence, once unnoticed, now seemed to irritate them. Ava, the receptionist, had barely looked up after the paperwork was exchanged, her dismissive attitude clear in every flick of her eyes as she typed on her phone. But the real change came when Tasha noticed a few more employees starting to glance at her with obvious skepticism. There was the tall, well-groomed salesman with a name tag reading Ethan, who had been circling nearby, pretending to look busy. His eyes would occasionally flicker in her direction, his face tight with an expression that was hard to place, but the disdain was unmistakable. The looks weren't subtle. Each one carried the silent message, "She doesn't belong here." Tasha resisted the urge to confront them. She wasn't here to get into an argument. Not yet. But something inside her was beginning to crack. She had built this empire from the ground up, and to be treated like an outsider in her own dealership, it felt like a betrayal. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a faint giggle, coming from Maria, a junior agent who had been working nearby. Tasha turned her head slightly to see Maria exchanging a look with Brian, another employee. The two shared a whispered moment, their conversation an obvious attempt to mask their judgment. Maria's eyes briefly met Tasha's, and the unspoken message passed between them. They were laughing at her, and it was painfully obvious. A cold knot formed in Tasha's stomach, but she didn't react. She couldn't. This was all part of the plan. She was here to observe, to feel what her clients experienced when they walked through this space. It was humiliating, yes, but she knew that now. She was in control. Tasha moved past Maria, her steps deliberate, heading for the Bentley she had noticed earlier. She ran her hand over the sleek surface of the car, maintaining a calm composure that belied the rising tension within her. She knew she had to stay in control, but the sting of their judgment was becoming harder to ignore, and that's when the door opened. The heavy thud of the doorbell echoed through the showroom as Tom, a middle-aged man, dressed in a crisp suit, stepped in. Tom was the sales manager. He exuded an air of authority, or at least he thought he did. His eyes scanned the showroom with a practiced glance, his face a mask of professionalism. But when his gaze landed on Tasha, the change in his demeanor was immediate. He took in her appearance, then turned toward Maria with a slight nod, as though confirming something unspoken. Tasha felt it before she saw it. Tom's body language had shifted, suddenly tense. He approached her with slow, deliberate steps, his posture rigid. As he got closer, Tasha's calm exterior remained in place, but inside, She was seething. She could already tell that the tension was escalating. The air in the showroom had become thick with unspoken hostility. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" Tom's voice was polite, but with an edge of forced civility. Tasha didn't flinch. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm just interested in the Bentley," she said, her voice steady, not giving away any hint of the frustration brewing inside her. Tom's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course," he said, glancing over at the others. He was already sizing her up, as if he could tell she didn't fit the profile of someone who would drop millions on a luxury car. He paused, his eyes scanning her attire, smart, but understated. It wasn't what you'd expect from someone who could afford the kind of car sitting in front of her. His gaze dropped to her shoes for a moment, just long enough for her to feel the judgment. "There are some papers we'll need to process first," Tom continued, his voice dismissive. "Just to make sure you're qualified for such a purchase." Tasha's smile never faltered, but her mind raced. She knew what he was doing. This wasn't about verifying credentials. This was about keeping her at arm's length. It was as if he wanted to remind her, and anyone watching, that she wasn't welcome in this world. His words stung, but she had heard them before. She had felt this bias in countless other spaces throughout her life. Just then, a sharp voice interrupted the tension. "Is everything okay here?" A security guard, Marcus, had appeared at the edge of the showroom. His uniform was crisp, but there was a visible discomfort in his stance as he surveyed the scene. He didn't quite know what was happening, but his instinct told him something wasn't right. His gaze shifted from Tom to Tasha, and back again. Tom glanced toward Marcus, his expression hardening. "This gentleman is, this lady is just here to look at some vehicles. I'm just getting some basic paperwork filled out." His tone was heavy with condescension, but he quickly added, "No need for you to worry." Tasha didn't miss the implication. He had called Marcus over for one reason, to make sure she felt uncomfortable, to make sure she knew she was being watched. "Thank you," Tasha said, addressing Marcus, her voice calm yet firm. She wasn't going to let them see how much it hurt. "I'm just looking at cars, like any other potential client." But the tension in the room had already shifted. Other customers, once oblivious to the interaction, were now turning their heads. It was impossible to ignore. The air felt thick with discomfort. A few of the clients who had been sipping their champagne now looked uneasy, glancing from Tasha to the staff and back again. The subtle shift was palpable. The uncomfortable truth was that they had noticed too. They had seen the bias. Marcus stood there, his hands at his sides, unsure of what to do. He wasn't comfortable with the situation, but he also knew his place. This was not his fight to fight. Not yet. Tasha could feel it, the weight of the judgment. But what was more unsettling was the knowledge that her presence was now the subject of whispered conversations. The staff was beginning to circle, closing in, and with every second that passed, the situation was escalating, but she wasn't sure how far it would go. She met Marcus's gaze again, holding it for a beat longer than necessary. He didn't say anything, but the unspoken understanding was there. He saw it too. He saw what they were doing to her. The tension in the showroom had reached a breaking point. It wasn't just the employees anymore. The other customers were starting to feel it too. The discomfort was growing, spreading through the space like a virus, and the question lingered in the air. How far would this go? Would Tasha just walk away, or would she confront the discrimination head-on? Tasha stood there for a moment, absorbing the tension that was thickening the air around her. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, from the staff, the security guard, and even the clients who had started to murmur amongst themselves. The uncomfortable glances were no longer subtle. They were open, pointed. Tasha had made it this far, staying calm in the face of each subtle insult, each dismissive glance. But the time for watching had passed. The tipping point came when Tom, the sales manager, placed a hand on her shoulder with an air of false familiarity. "Maybe it's time for you to head over to one of our other locations," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We cater to a very specific clientele here, and, well, you know, we have higher-end buyers." His words, though polite on the surface, were laced with a deep-seated bias that Tasha could feel radiating through his fingertips as they rested briefly on her shoulder. That was it. She had had enough. With a deep breath, Tasha slowly pulled away from him, her gaze unwavering. She straightened her back, standing taller than she had felt all morning. It was time for the game to end. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket, where she had kept a small leather portfolio hidden. The staff had underestimated her, treating her like a mere obstacle in the way of their real customers. But today, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. As she opened the portfolio, the showroom fell into an almost eerie silence. Tasha pulled out a sleek black card. It wasn't just any card. It was her executive access card. A piece of plastic that granted her entry to every floor of the building, every boardroom, and every corporate decision. She held it up for all to see, but she didn't say a word. Her actions spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Ava, who had been typing away at the front desk, looked up first. Her eyes widened slightly, betraying her shock as she saw the card in Tasha's hand. A moment of recognition flashed across her face, and then it was gone, replaced by an awkward smile that didn't quite mask the discomfort. "What's this?" Tom asked, trying to play it cool, but his voice cracked slightly as he stared at the card. The realization was setting in, and his body language began to shift, no longer composed, no longer in control. Tasha's voice was calm, steady, but it held a power that made everyone in the room stop in their tracks. "That," she said, her eyes, never leaving Tom's now uneasy face, "is my access card. It grants me full access to every floor in this building, including the executive suites, and I'm the one who signs your paychecks." There was a brief moment of stunned silence. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of Tasha's revelation. The once dismissive expressions of the staff, of Tom, of Ava, of Maria, who had been so quick to judge her, shifted dramatically. It was as though the rug had been pulled out from beneath them, leaving them stranded in a sea of disbelief. Tasha watched as the realization dawned on them. Their eyes flicked to each other, trying to process what they had just heard, but it was too late. The mask of polite indifference had slipped, and now they had nowhere to hide. Ava, unable to mask her shock any longer, blurted out, wait, you're the CEO." Her voice was strained, an edge of panic creeping in. Tasha didn't flinch. "Yes, I am," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "And I've been listening to you, all of you, and I've been watching." She took a step closer, her gaze locked onto each of them in turn. "You've all made a lot of assumptions about me today. Assumptions about my ability to afford the things in this showroom, about my status, and about who I am as a person. But the truth is, you've all been wrong." Tom, his expression now a mix of frustration and fear, tried to regain some semblance of control. "This is a mistake," he stammered. We weren't treating you differently." No, Tom," Tasha interrupted, her voice firm. "You were. You just didn't think I would find out. You didn't think I'd notice how. You assumed I couldn't afford the car. How you assumed I wasn't worthy of your time. You didn't think I'd notice that I was treated like an outsider in my own company." She glanced over at the other employees, their faces reddening with shame, but still not willing to admit their actions. "And you certainly didn't think that the very person who built this dealership from the ground up, would be standing here, calling you out." There was no more bravado in Tom's voice. He took a step back, eyes darting nervously to the other staff members, who seemed to shrink under Tasha's unwavering stare. "You're wrong, Maria," the junior agent muttered, her voice barely a whisper. "We didn't mean to disrespect you." Tasha held up her hand, silencing her. "Don't make excuses," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I've heard enough. The way you treated me today is not an isolated incident. I've seen it happen before with other clients. Clients who don't look like you, who don't fit into the narrow mold you've created for your real customers. This isn't a mistake. This is a pattern, and I'm here to expose it." Ava nervously ran her fingers through her hair, shifting uncomfortably. "What do you want us to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tasha stood tall, unfazed by the unease in the room. She pulled out a second document from her portfolio, this time a printed memo on company letterhead, emblazoned with her name at the top. "What I want," she said, holding the document up for all to see, "is for you to realize the impact of your actions. And I want you to understand that your behavior has consequences." The memo, which had been quietly passed around to the others, was enough to finish the job. It was a formal notice. The company's internal audit division had been monitoring discriminatory behavior, and the evidence gathered over the past several months was about to be made public. The staff members who had been complicit in such behavior were now named in the report. The realization hit them like a ton of bricks. Their smugness, their comfort in knowing they were above reproach, was shattered. Tasha's next words were as final as they were chilling. "I am no longer asking for your cooperation. I'm demanding it, and you will answer for your actions." The tension in the room was palpable. The luxury dealership, once a space of polished cars and extravagant wealth, had turned into an arena of reckoning. The employees who had once looked down upon their customers, assuming the mantle of superiority without a second thought, now found themselves standing on the edge of professional ruin. They had no idea that the person they had so callously dismissed was their CEO, someone who had been watching, listening, and processing everything. Tasha James stood at the head of the room, the embodiment of calm authority. Her dark eyes swept across the room, each person in the showroom now acutely aware that this wasn't just a routine matter of customer relations. This was a moment that would change the course of the company and their lives. She had spent years building her reputation, not just as a successful CEO, but as someone who would never tolerate injustice, especially when it was rooted in systemic racism. The clock was ticking, and the reckoning was here. The employees shuffled nervously, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Tom, the manager, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to remain composed, but clearly rattled. Janet, the senior agent, who had once moved through the dealership with an air of invincibility, now fidgeted, her professional demeanor faltering. Ashley, the receptionist, was almost completely frozen, her face pale as she avoided making eye contact with Tasha. Decision was final, and she had come to terms with what needed to happen. This wasn't just a matter of reprimanding a few bad apples. It was about dismantling a culture of bias that had infected the dealership from the very top. It was about setting a precedent that no one, not even the employees who had worked here for years, was above the consequences of their actions. The time for excuses had passed. "You are all aware of what happened here today," Tasha began, her voice steady, yet carrying the weight of the moment. "What you may not fully understand is how deep this goes. This incident didn't just reflect poor customer service. It revealed a culture of discrimination that has plagued this company for far too long. It's not just about the way you treated me. It's about how you've treated every person who doesn't look like you, who doesn't fit the mold of who you think belongs here." Her words struck with precision. It wasn't just the incident with her that was under examination. It was the systemic issues that had been ignored and allowed to fester. She had seen it, heard the stories, and now it was time to make it all known to those who had participated in this culture. Tom, who had managed the showroom for years, tried to justify himself. "Look, this is a high-end business. We can't just let anyone walk in and waste our time. We have to be selective about who we allow in." Tasha's gaze was unwavering. Selective. You're talking about customers who deserve respect, not who you think can afford a car. Your job is not to judge whether someone fits the image of our ideal buyer. Your job is to provide excellent service to everyone who walks through that door, and that includes not judging them based on their race, their clothing, or the assumptions you've made about their worth. There was silence. The room had grown even more tense, and Tasha could see the realization starting to sink in. The employees, who had grown accustomed to turning away people based on their own biases, were now fully aware that their time was running out. I've made it clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated in my company, she continued, her voice rising with the power of her decision. So now, you all have a choice. The consequences of your actions are clear. You can either choose to resign, knowing that your behavior has been exposed, or you can face termination. Either way, you will not work here again. The words were heavy, but necessary. Tasha had seen too many people in positions of power abuse their status. Too many employees get away with discrimination because of their position. But this was different. She was setting a new standard. A standard that no one, not even the most senior employees, would be able to ignore. Her eyes fell on Ashley, the receptionist who had first belittled her. Ashley, you took the first step in humiliating a client, assuming I couldn't afford to be here. You're the one who photographed me without permission, shared it on Slack, and made a joke out of my presence here. That's not only unprofessional, it's illegal, and you will face the consequences. Ashley's eyes welled up with tears, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She knew what was coming. The weight of her actions was too much to bear. Tom tried again, his voice trembling. Tasha, please, we never intended for it to go this far. We were just following the procedures, trying to protect the company. It was never about race. It was just, stop, Tasha interjected, her tone sharp. Don't try to deflect. You may not have meant for it to go this far, but your actions speak louder than your words. You allowed this environment to thrive, and now, you have to own it. The other employees in the room, who had been silent until now, began to squirm. No one wanted to be next in line for judgment. The tension was unbearable, but it was a tension that had to be experienced if the company was to move forward. The moment had arrived. The employees had a decision to make. They could either own up to their mistakes and resign, taking accountability for their actions, or they could face the wrath of the consequences. Tasha made sure they understood the gravity of the situation. You are not above this company. No one is, she said. I am not above this company. We are all accountable for what happens here, and for the environment we create. This is bigger than just one incident. This is about systemic racism, and it stops today. Tom, visibly shaken, looked toward the door, as if trying to escape the reality of the situation. Janet, once so confident, was now at a loss for words. Ashley began to sob quietly, realizing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. You all will face the public consequences of this, Tasha added, her voice cold and resolute. I won't protect you. You've created this mess, and now you'll have to clean it up, but not here, not under my leadership. Your careers at James Luxury Motors are over. As the weight of the decision settled in, the employees could no longer hide behind excuses. The room grew silent, filled only with the sounds of their own unease. Tasha's power had been asserted. The ball was in their court now. There was no turning back. The days that followed the public exposure of the dealership's bias were a whirlwind. Tasha's phone buzzed, non-stop, filled with messages from board members, employees, and the media. The initial shock had given way to introspection, and now, the weight of her decision to go public was beginning to sink in. The world was watching. It wasn't just about her dealership anymore. It was about the future of the entire industry. She spent the following days locked in meetings with her executive team, legal advisors, and HR professionals. The company's internal audit division had worked overtime, gathering data, tracking complaints, and pulling together a comprehensive report. The evidence was undeniable. Discrimination was deeply embedded within the culture of the dealership. But Tasha was determined that this would be the turning point, not just for her dealership, but for the industry as a whole. The announcement came quickly, but with purpose. Tasha stood before a crowd of employees, media representatives, and influencers, many of whom had been involved in the viral story, ready to address the public. Her heart raced, but her mind was clear. This was her moment to not only reclaim her company's reputation, but to challenge the systemic issues that ran deeper than just her own experience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tasha began, her voice firm but steady. "I am here today, not as the CEO of James Luxury Motors, but as someone who has witnessed firsthand the harm that unconscious bias, discrimination, and prejudice can inflict on individuals. Our company has been complicit in this, and we are taking full responsibility for our actions." The room fell silent, and the weight of her words hung in the air. Tasha knew that this moment, her voice, her authority, could be the spark that would ignite real change. "We are announcing today," she continued, "a company-wide overhaul. This dealership, which I founded, will now lead the way in anti-bias training, inclusive hiring practices, and diversity initiatives. We are committed to ensuring that every person who walks through these doors, regardless of race, background, or appearance, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." Tasha paused, allowing her words to settle. The crowd, which had been skeptical at first, now began to nod in agreement. She wasn't just making a statement for her company. She was setting the stage for a larger conversation, one that was long overdue. The changes were extensive and immediate. Every employee, from the sales team to the security guards, would undergo mandatory anti-bias training within the next 60 days. The company's diversity and inclusion strategy would be expanded, ensuring that minority representation increased at every level. The hiring process would no longer focus solely on resumes, but also on a candidate's commitment to inclusivity. All future promotions would be based on merit and values, not just sales numbers or seniority. Tasha made it clear that these changes weren't optional. "This is not a nice-to-have," she said. "This is a must-have, and I am holding myself and every employee accountable for our collective success." She looked around at the faces in the room, each one listening intently, knowing that this was not just a company announcement, but a pledge to rebuild trust. "I believe in the power of transformation, and I believe that every business has the potential to do better. We will do better. We must." The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. News outlets picked up the story, and social media erupted with praise for Tasha's bold stance. People shared the story, commenting on the CEO's bravery, her transparency, and her commitment to confronting uncomfortable truths. The hashtag James Luxury Reform began trending, with users posting messages of support and admiration. It was clear that Tasha had not only salvaged her company's reputation, but had also sparked a nationwide conversation about racism, privilege, and accountability in the corporate world. But, while much of the response was positive, there were those who criticized the speed of the reforms. Some detractors questioned whether the dealership's internal culture could really change overnight, and whether Tasha was only responding to the media firestorm rather than taking real, long-term action. Tasha knew these voices would be there. She expected them, but she also understood that true transformation wouldn't come without resistance, and she was ready for it. The mixed reaction only fueled her resolve to prove that her commitment to change wasn't just a PR move. This was a foundational shift, one that she intended to see through to the end. In the weeks that followed, the company began to implement the changes it had promised. Internal audits were conducted regularly, and any form of discriminatory behavior was met with swift consequences. Customers who had once felt marginalized began to speak up, sharing their stories of how the dealership had treated them differently based on their race or background. These voices, once silenced, were now given the platform they deserved, and as they did, the company's commitment to inclusivity grew stronger. In addition to the internal changes, Tasha's leadership took the form of public advocacy. She began speaking at conferences, on podcasts, and in front of media outlets, urging other companies to take similar steps. "It's not enough to say you believe in equality," she said in one interview. "You have to prove it. You have to show up, and you have to put in the work. And that work is hard. It takes effort. It takes humility. But it is worth it." The future of corporate America depends on how seriously we take the task of inclusion. Meanwhile, competitors in the industry began to take note of the transformation happening at James Luxury Motors. Some cautiously began to follow T's lead, announcing their own plans to implement diversity initiatives and anti-bias training. The ripple effect was undeniable. Tasha had not only transformed her own company, she had set a new standard for others to follow. Public figures, celebrities, and influencers who had once been wary of the corporate world began showing interest in partnering with James Luxury Motors. The company's reputation was no longer about luxury cars. It was about leadership, integrity, and a willingness to do what was right. Tasha's heart swelled with pride as she watched the dealership evolve, knowing that she had played a pivotal role in shifting the narrative. But she was not done yet. The work of true change was never finished. It required vigilance, accountability, and a continual commitment to improvement. As Tasha stood before her employees once more, the weight of her mission settled comfortably into her bones. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "What we've started here is not just about making our dealership better. It's about making the world a better place. It's about creating spaces where everyone belongs, and it starts with us." Months had passed since the viral incident that had thrust Tasha James into the spotlight. What had started as an undercover experiment in her own dealership had transformed not only the culture of James Luxury Motors, but also her perspective on leadership. She sat in her office now, gazing out over the city, a city that felt both the same and profoundly different after everything that had unfolded. The view of Manhattan, once a symbol of success and power, now seemed to reflect the deeper layers of her own journey. Complex, challenging, yet filled with potential. The changes she had instigated within the dealership were tangible. Her employees, once complicit in the subtle biases that had plagued the company, were now engaged in active anti-bias training, committed to creating an environment of inclusivity. The customer base, which had once been dominated by a select group, was diversifying, and the reputation of her company, once tainted by discrimination, was beginning to shift toward a more positive, values-driven narrative. James Luxury Motors was no longer just about luxury cars. It was about leadership, courage, and the willingness to challenge the status quo. But for Tasha, the transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. The day she stood before her employees and publicly addressed the discrimination that had occurred in her dealership was a turning point. It was a moment that had required not only strength, but vulnerability. In that moment, Tasha wasn't just the CEO of a company. She was a woman who had been on the receiving end of bias, and she was choosing to confront it head-on, not for her own sake, but for the sake of others who had endured the same mistreatment. Looking back on that day, she remembered the faces of the employees who had been exposed: Tom, Janet, and Ashley. They had been forced to reckon with their actions, with their own biases, and the consequences of treating people based on assumptions about race, appearance, and status. The decision to publicly hold them accountable had been difficult, but it was necessary. There was no other way forward. If she hadn't confronted their behavior, if she had allowed it to remain hidden under a veil of polite corporate practices, nothing would have changed. It was the most challenging decision she had ever made as a leader, but it was also the most important. The hardest part, though, was not the confrontation or the public fallout. It was the internal struggle Tasha had faced. She had always been a person of principle, But to be that person in a world where so much was driven by profit and power felt isolating. She had wondered if the changes she was pushing for would stick, or if they would simply be a momentary flash of good intentions. She had been terrified that the backlash would be too great, that she would lose everything, not just her reputation, but the core of her beliefs. But as the months passed, and the results started to speak for themselves, Tasha realized something profound. The true power of leadership lay not in the ability to maintain control, but in the ability to relinquish control when necessary, to step back, admit mistakes, and empower others to be better. Leadership, she discovered, wasn't about being untouchable or flawless. It was about authenticity, vulnerability, and creating a space where others could see their own faults and work toward change. The experience had also changed her approach to leadership. Tasha had always been driven, always determined to prove herself in a world that hadn't made it easy for her. But now, she approached leadership with a new sense of humility. She understood that her role was not just to lead, but to inspire others to lead with the same integrity and courage she had shown. It wasn't enough to simply implement policies. She had to set an example. She had to be the change she wanted to see in her company and in the industry. Tasha's commitment to dismantling systemic racism had become a cornerstone of her leadership philosophy. She realized that it wasn't enough to just speak out against bias. She had to build systems, hire people, and implement processes that actively worked to prevent discrimination from taking root again. Her vision was no longer confined to the walls of James Luxury Motors. It had grown beyond the dealership and extended to the broader corporate world. Tasha began speaking at conferences, sitting on panels, and advocating for systemic change within the luxury automobile industry. Her voice was now one of authority, but it was also one of empathy. She knew firsthand the pain of being judged based on her appearance, and she was determined to ensure that others wouldn't have to suffer in the same way. The work was ongoing, and Tasha knew that the journey toward true equity was long and complicated. There would always be setbacks, there would always be challenges, but she also knew that the work was worth it. Every small victory, every step toward greater inclusivity, was a step in the right direction. Her employees, too, were on this journey with her, as they underwent anti-bias training and took part in discussions about diversity and inclusion. Tasha saw a shift in the way they approached their roles. They began to understand that their work wasn't just about selling cars. It was about creating an environment where all people, regardless of their background, felt welcomed, respected, and valued. In the end, Tasha's story wasn't just about a CEO standing up against discrimination. It was about empowerment, about using her position to create a ripple effect that would impact generations to come. She wasn't just leading a company, she was leading a movement. Her journey had proven that change, though difficult, was possible, and it had shown her that real leadership was not about asserting control over others. It was about empowering others to rise, to challenge the status quo, and to be the change that they wanted to see in the world. As she sat in her office, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, Tasha felt a quiet sense of pride. She had done what many thought impossible, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. And as she looked out over the city, she knew that her work wasn't finished. The road ahead was long, but she was no longer walking it alone. Her employees, her customers, and the industry at large were walking with her, and together, they would build a future where discrimination had no place.